for making the time.
Yeah, sure.
It's nice to do one of these in person. We talked about it briefly, and it's super cool that you had the time and thanks Christian for connecting us. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Work feed.
Uh-huh.
Right? He connected us. I think you put some money. You invested in them. Or
yes, I
something, right?
did.
Yeah.
Yes, that was actually the first.
Yeah.
Or second investment I did when I came back to Denmark and started getting involved with the startup scene here.
Yeah, we'll talk about that for sure. Also, I'm interested personally, So I think he put us in touch, and we had some back and forth briefly, and then like this came up, and serendipity. I had Jason on as sort of a soft relaunch of my very very unorganized show. But thank you for making the time. How has it been like moving back to Copenhagen? It's been how many years now?
It's been 3 years. So we came back in the fall of 2020, just when we realized that the schools back in Malibu weren't going to reopen for the new school year. We'd already been in lockdown for 5 months, I think, at that point. And we were like, yeah, no, we're not doing this any longer. The kids deserve something better than this. And our patience, frankly, as homeschoolers were worn out. And when I say ours, I mostly mean my wife. It was just time to try something else. And it seemed like the perfect opportunity to essentially spin the globe, which is what we did. So we took a globe or a Google map and laid it out and like, where should we go? Like, I don't have to be anywhere in particular. There's nothing holding us to any specific location. So we looked at a bunch of different places. We looked at Switzerland, we looked at New Zealand, and then we looked at Denmark and was like, oh yeah, maybe, I guess we could consider that. I mean, I'd moved to the US in 2005 and I'd barely been back in 15 years. I think I'd spent maybe 4 weeks over 15 years in Copenhagen since then. Copenhagen or Denmark used to have a really crazy tax regime for Danish citizens who were living abroad and working abroad, that if you came back and you just worked one day and work was defined as essentially taking a phone call or answering an email, you'd be tax liable for the whole year. And I was just like, yeah, I'm not going to run that risk of a country I don't even live in deciding that they want they want taxes for a whole year just because of that. So that basically kept me out of the country for a very long time. Since things have gotten a little more sane, there's some high profile cases of people just went like, this is crazy, that went through and changed the practice. And now it's actually such that if you are a Dane living abroad and working abroad, you can come back and like, I think you have like 10 joker days. So you could come back and like for 10 days, you could do some work if that was needed without triggering this whole regime. So anyway, we looked at this whole setup, where we could go, and then we looked at the pandemic response. And the pandemic response, even from afar in Copenhagen and in Denmark, just looked so much more sane, so much more measured, so much more willing to consider the trade-offs that say, oh, lockdowns are not free. Keeping kids out of school have serious consequences. We should try to do that as little as possible. And even before we moved, that was just such a breath of fresh air compared to the American response, which was essentially politicize the whole thing, cut it into two binary choices. Either you're a MAGA pandemic denying nut, or you're like, kids should basically never go back to school because what if they get something, right? And you're just like, we couldn't see ourselves in either of those extremes. And watching the Danish response just gave us a lot of confidence that we could move here and the kids could have a relatively normal life. And that's exactly what happened. We moved back in the fall. The kids started in school. And like there were minor things you had to contend with, but it was essentially quote unquote normal.
So you moved during the pandemic?
During the pandemic.
Yeah.
And fall of 2020, kids starting in Danish school, or actually not in Danish school, in international school, but here in Copenhagen. And we were just like, this is great. But we're also coming to the end of it.
Okay.
So it's been 3 years now, and we're going to move back to the US.
Okay. So I caught you just before you left.
Yes, you did, basically.
Nice. And why the move back? Is it kind of like you're done with the honeymoon period's over and let's move back? Or?
There's a little bit of the honeymoon period being over. Our kids went to Danish school this year. They'd gone to international school for 2 years. And having kids in international school allows you to live in a bit of a expat bubble. And that expat bubble has a lot of great qualities to it. Copenhagen in particular is a very international city. You can live in an expat bubble. But we were like, you know what? If we want to consider an option that we stay here for the long term, like that's not, the kids got to learn Danish. So we put them in Danish school, and then we got essentially the full reintroduction to Danish culture and Danish mores and everything that makes Denmark so strong and powerful when it comes to something like a unified pandemic response is also the same reason why I left in 2005. Like the box is quite small, quite narrow. I mean, it's funny. My wife had heard these stories about Jante Law. Like, you're with any Dane, you'll hear that. And you're like, you know what? It seems like it's overstated. And when you live in an expat bubble, it does seem overstated. Like that doesn't really apply to you. Then as soon as you integrate more fully, you realize, no, that's actually sort of how it is. And you can choose to have a different response to it. I have I don't give a fuck what people think response. I don't think that's a normal human response. Most people do give a fuck to some extent what other people think about them and how they act and whatever. And I think,
I think I'll interrupt you for a second because I think you say something really important because I'm similar to you, and I moved here very late in my life, and I'm living here because I love my wife, I love my kids, and I want to stay here for now, right? And I really enjoy it, but I think I haven't been surrounded sort of solely by Danes. I'm sort of living the Derek Sivers style life. Like I'm locally here, but I'm working online
Yes.
until recently, and now I'm also working here more. But I think I wanna understand from your perspective, like what is this Jante Law thing, and what begets someone like you to have a response like you do.
So I'll illustrate by an example. Our kids go to these Danish schools, and at one point there's some setup where you give like a birthday gift or something, and nominally the whatever amount you should spend, let's say, is 50 kroners. And then if by accident or whatever you end up spending 65 kroners, that's a thing.
Oh wow!
Like that's now like, hey, you sort of broke this covenant we had. We agreed that it was X. You spent like X plus 2%. Now that's ricocheting the social dynamics to a point. What do you think you're better than us? Do you think like now should we all do this? Well, we agreed at this that it was the other thing, and now you actually broke the agreement. Like the tolerances on the social dynamics are very slim in a way that's completely foreign to an American mentality. Whereas in the US, you'd just be like, oh, great, awesome, cool. That difference, that distinction, I think is part and partial of why the Danish system works so well. Because 80% of the population are within this extremely compressed band of equality. Like everyone's making roughly the same, going the same places, and it has all these wonderful qualities. But it's also fiercely guarded. That is how it is. We can't have any sort of swings on that. If we're in this class, like we're all equal, and any hint, however slight, that may or may not be true, is a seriously taboo issue that just triggers these things. And of course, this is a trivial example, and you could just say like, well, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. But I think it really is a big deal. I think it is the power and the cohesion of an extremely homogenous society that has some very strong cultural sort of ties, but also boundaries. And that cohesion allows us to have all these wonderful things that you can pay as high taxes as Danes do and broadly be okay with it because you think that those funds go to pay for healthcare and education for someone who's like you. And I think this is one of the big surprises for me, was that I had this sort of two-part reaction. The first reaction moving back to Denmark was like, holy smokes, this works so well. The society is so organized, so efficient, so caring in the sense that like we'll extend these social safety nets and they work really well. And then you contrast that to America and you go like, Jesus, what a shit show over there. Like, why does nothing work? Why is everything dispersed? Why are there no centralized decision-making that can take proper effect? Why is there such division? And the initial response for me is like, Denmark is just better. It's just better. Like Danes, for whatever reason, they have it figured out, right? Then the longer you live here, the more you realize that that level of efficiency is just not free. It comes from all this enforcement. Janteloven is a key guarantee of these principles. It holds things together. It binds people inside a box that is quite explicitly drawn out, and that allows us to get all these things. Then you look at America, and you go, well, it doesn't have any of those things. It's a country of fierce individualists. But that also means it's a very easy country to integrate into. So the example I often give is I'll arrive at border control in the US, landing in JFK or LAX or whatever, and the border agent I'll meet has like a thick accent. And it's just sort of like the incarnate American with a thick accent of whatever.
Like a non-American accent.
Non-American accent. Or perhaps to some extent, it is very American accent, as in there is an accent, and it's just not a big deal. Not only is it not a big deal, it's almost celebrated, if it not even outright is celebrated. And you just go like, yeah, I can find my place here and feel like I'm part of America without having to become like every other American. That is a really unique setup that is the polar opposite of Denmark. There is no way you're becoming like part of Denmark and not becoming not just fluent in Danish, but preferably without any trace of an accent, right? So
you're hitting a lot of triggers on me right now, but go on.
Well, so this was what happened when we moved here. My wife had to learn Danish. The immigration process is brutal.
Oh, we'll talk about that for sure. Yeah.
And one of the requirements very early on was after 6 months of being here, she had to pass her first exam. After 9 months, she had to pass her second exam. These are exams in like conversational Danish. She had to study a ton to be able to pass those exams. And she did with flying colors because that's who she is. She just dedicates herself to figuring it out. And then I could see the reaction she would get when she would speak Danish. She wouldn't speak Danish. She would speak Danish with an American accent. Of course she would, because she's an American and she moved here and she learned the language and so on. Very clear that like that was never going to pass muster as for being a Dane. And Danes have, in my opinion, this kind of two-tiered approach. They're very kind to tourists. Like, oh, it's so great you're here. You should see all these things. You should go everywhere. And then as soon as that tourist decides, hey, oh yeah, cool, I want to stay here, then they're extremely harsh. Hey, why aren't you perfect in Danish yet? Like, are you working yet? Have you gotten a job at a Danish company? Have you done all the things? And there's a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde mentality to that approach that is not very endearing to someone who comes here from abroad. And again, it's in service of this larger picture. This society, constructed in this way, works because we are broadly the same. And if you want to be part of that, you have to become one of us. Like, it's not like that's a conspiracy theory. Most Danish politicians, most Danes would say that outright. If you want to immigrate into Denmark, you better damn well become a Dane. Where's your Danish flag? Get it out and wave it around on your birthdays, in the airport, all these places, right? America is very, very different. And I came to appreciate what America offers in that regard far more from being here.
Yeah, okay. Makes sense. No, I mean, you hit on a lot of really interesting points also because I think one point I want to sort of touch on, I grew up in an international school. So I grew up in India and I went to mostly Hindi school. So Hindi is my first language. And for the longest time, I think till I was about 12, my English wasn't very good. I didn't speak great English. It was like, most people in India speak grammatically correct English, but they have a very thick accent. And sometimes that's perceived as bad English, right? Which is incorrect, as we've touched on already. But I think moving to international school for me opened my world, because I went from my parents made a very strategic decision that, okay, we want our kids to be Indian, but also know that the world exists. And so I went from sort of having friends from the same 20-kilometer radius to having friends from 80 nationalities. And my first 5-6 crushes were Korean, Guyanese, from Scandinavia, all over the world, right? And I think that's sort of my best friends are from all over the world, and I think that sort of made me. When I graduated high school, I came to Europe and I traveled, and I literally didn't pay a cent because I stayed in friends' houses all over Europe, right? And I think that is really great because you sort of have this global mindset, and everyone's kind of the same, because it's not about the color of your skin or the accent. It's about what are you interested in, what are you working on, how can we collaborate, what can we do, or if you're an asshole in every color, And then sort of meeting my wife, she's friends with one of her friends from when she was 3 years old that grew up in the same little town. She's still really close friends with her. And I was like, oh, wow, that's beautiful too, right? I don't have that. I don't have my friend from when I was 6 or 5, right? And I think it kind of correlates to your point. It is that sort of, if you want to stay here, there's a set of rules. And if you can fit in those rules, it'll be amazing. But if you stand out even a little bit or a lot, right? Because it doesn't really matter once you're out of the rule set. If it's 1% or 50%, doesn't matter. Then it might be a problem, right? And I think I'm sort of attracted to people like that, because I think that's how I am. I'm like, yeah, if everyone's doing Zig, I kind of want to check out what Zag's about, right? Let's just see it. Maybe it's something different. So I think that's also why I sort of have resonated with the sort of content you and Jason and the crew have been putting out. Also because, I'll take an example. Sorry, let's go back to sort of your company for a second. You guys put out this really awesome video campaign, marketing campaign, where you spend a lot of money on promoting it, and the video doesn't look like a tech company video. It feels really fresh and also a little old school. It sounds weird to say it that way, but it feels really cool. And I remember I was like, it kind of reminded me of, early 2005, 6 sort of Web 2.0 apps, where it was like we were trying shit. We were like, let's just try it. Let's just, no one has anything figured out yet. Let's just try it. It sort of resonated back to that time. But has it always been a DNA of you and the company to sort of try things that are different? Or I mean, maybe let me rephrase the question. Why has that always been the case? Because it's not normal, right? Most people were like, okay, best practices, let's go do that, right? How do you guys, you specifically, why do you think it differently?
I think both Jason and I are cut from the same cloth when it comes to this kind of stuff. We have a fierce independence that borders on outright skepticism when it comes to whatever is the established way of doing things. And part of that came from the time both Jason and I came up in the industry. So we both worked during the dot-com boom area, and we went through the dot-com bust era as well. And seeing what the standard playbook brought upon companies and people, I think just gave us an extra turbocharge of skepticism towards how the technology industry operates. And I think that just played into both of our personalities, that we were like, do you know what? Here's an approach. Here's a set of principles that people are following. I want to test that premise. I want to retest that experiment. I want to verify that that's actually true today. It's true at our size. It's true in our domain. It's true whatever. And I think what we found was something akin to the replication crises in the social sciences, that a lot of the business advice and the playbook of venture capital and so on was just bunk. It did not work in a bunch of contexts. It did not work in our context. And that led us to be even more fiercely interested in exploring things from first principles, exploring things from like, all right, but it may work. Like here you have a proposition about how businesses should run or how marketing should be done or how to build software or so forth. I'm not like saying it can't work. I'm saying I want to see proof. And a lot of that testing then came through the fact that Jason and I run this company ourselves. We don't answer to investors. We don't answer to a board. We don't answer to essentially anyone except customers and to an extent also employees. But we get to do all the things no one would ever give us permission to do, which means that we can pursue things that others might deem risky or low odds or whatever. And sometimes it doesn't work. We try things all the time. Like, for example, this marketing campaign that we've been on for this year. Not entirely sure whether that actually works. It was fun to do. It was illuminating to retest some beliefs we had about marketing because we've been in business for well over 20 years. And I think you should have the humility to expect that when you've been in business for that long, some of your ideas that might have been true when you started are no longer true. There's a half-life to most arguments, to most positions, to most premises. And unless you continue to test those at regular intervals, you'll find that you'll be operating on principles that are no longer true. And I think this is where that saying that it's not what you don't know that hurts you, it's what you know that isn't so. I'm petrified of that to some extent. Petrified of thinking I know something to be a fact and then finding out that it isn't. Or I don't know if petrified is the right. I'm interested in finding out which of the facts I consider to be true aren't, and where can I change my mind? And sometimes that's simply a factor of like, do you know what? Time changes. When we started working on Basecamp back in 2003, the iPhone was still like 4 years in the future. SaaS wasn't even coined as a term.
That's crazy. Yeah.
There was no Stripe. You had to go down to your literal bank branch to convince them to allow you to take credit cards. It was just a different world. And what normally happens to most people and most companies is that they will inform the core beliefs based on the context in which they were born. So given the fact that we're now a 20-plus-year-old company, invariably there'll be some of these premises that are no longer true. So that goes part of it. And then I also just find it fun. I find it fun intellectually to prod at ideas, to take the opposite side. Whenever I hear consensus, I get skeptical. And I think we talked about COVID starting out here. This was perhaps one of the things that supercharged my skepticism about consensus in general. It's just how utterly, to some extent, even pathetically wrong the consensus was on COVID measures for so much longer than I would deem reasonable. Again, when no one knows anything, do you know what? We're going to do the best with what we have. But as soon as the data comes in, as soon as the facts start piling up, you should be willing to reconsider your premise. But this is one of those difficult things, and I just think we see this, especially in the political realm. Once you've taken a position, it's so hard to back out of it, even if it proves wrong. I do not want to be there as a business. I want to back out of any position I've taken as soon as it's evident that it's wrong. Then we can do something else. And then we can celebrate to some extent. You know what? Here was a thing that made sense for 5 years. It no longer makes sense, so now we'll do the other thing that makes sense now. But that requires a certain rebellious streak, I think. And this is the problem with consensus. Consensus convinces people that, you know what, there's no more time or reason for inquiry. There's always time and reason for inquiry. Whenever you're afraid to debate the facts, the premise, the argument, that to me is a huge waving red flag of just like, you know what? That alone will usually convince me something smells here. Something smells. And we saw this on so many topics in COVID area. If you just take something as basic as like lab leak, right? Lab leak theory went from like, this is misinformation, needs to be banned from all these platforms, to like, oh, shit, actually maybe lab leak is the most likely scenario now. And there was just last week coming out like, oh, maybe patient zero were actually the people who worked in the Wuhan virus lab. The particulars don't even really matter to me. It's intellectual approach to reasoning, to facts, to science as a process, not an outcome. All these elements, I think, are true in the world at large, and they're true in the world at small, within a single company.
I think with my new company, we're kind of trying to do that as well. Actually for science, but that's a different topic. I think what's interesting is that it's essentially the pursuit of truth, right? Essentially, it's like, okay, let me just challenge my assumptions, right? And let me just see if I'm right, or if what I'm doing is the best way for me, right? And I think, isn't that kind of it? Or
yes, I think the whole Veritas motto is spot on here. It's very difficult to live that motto, I think. And to some extent, it's become more difficult in this social media world that we have. More of us have become more like politicians more of the time, that we align ourselves with certain factions online, certain mobs, certain ideologies, and then we feel obligated to defend those ideas just on the premise of group cohesion. And I don't think that's good. I think it's actually a major regression for our ability to progress in our understanding at large, that so many people take positions online because so few people are willing to go back on those positions. So, as an example, I posted in, I think, early last year or late 21, I forget, when the Canadian trucker protests were going on. That forced me, that was sort of one of these moments in time where I went like, I had not foreseen this outcome. I could not, it didn't fit my mental model of what the country of Canada was all about, like the approach to this. And I just went like, do you know what? Let me just do an inventory here. What do I believe to be true as it relates to these matters, like getting your bank account shut because you participated in a protest, or even worse, getting your bank account shut because you donated to others who participated in the protest? That is like levels of paranoia I didn't even know were reasonable to hold.
In Canada, like
in Canada of all places, particularly, right? And of course, there's plenty of observers like, oh, this was obvious for so long. Like, well, it wasn't obvious to me. It was not obvious to me. And this is what I mean, enjoy is a big word, but I like the challenge of like, do you know what? I thought the world worked in a certain way. I thought like this area of the world, Canada, for example, in particular, was this kind of country. And then suddenly you get evidence that it's a different kind of country that didn't fit my mental model. And I used that to sort of trace the lineage of ideas to things like money and so forth. And one of the traces it went was to Bitcoin. And I've been a huge Bitcoin, I don't know if opponent is the right word, but like I've not been a crypto bug.
You're not an early adopter.
No. I've been highly skeptical of the whole endeavor, right? And part of that skepticism was based on a belief that money wasn't going to be weaponized as a form of political jousting. And when the Canadian thing happened, it just went like, oh, so a bunch of the things that I thought the Bitcoin folks were just paranoid about, unreasonably so, paranoid in the sense that like they're not really after you, they were really after them. And I just went like, huh.
And if it can happen in Canada, it can happen anywhere.
That was my analysis then. Then it went like, okay, if it can happen in Canada, Canada is not otherwise, again, fits this model of where I would expect it to happen in an authoritarian regime of some other kind. We go, all right, I could totally see it happening in all sorts of other places. And then I went, like, if it can happen in all sorts of other places, my conception of, like, the soundness of money and the right to transact and all these other related principles are suddenly in play. So I went out very publicly to say, you know what? I think I might have gotten Bitcoin wrong. I think the fundamental premise is more important than I thought it was. And I just want to come out and say that. Like, I've been such a big opponent or skeptic, let's say skeptic, better word, such a big skeptic of Bitcoin for so many years, so publicly kind of denouncing a bunch of things around that now this new, to me, set of facts are coming in, and I've changed my position. And it had this huge response because that's sadly not common. It is not common that someone takes strong positions against something like Bitcoin and then changes their mind when new, fresh data comes in.
And is also public about it, right?
And is also public about it.
Public about both, right? Public about sort of the stance 1, and then
Yes.
new data,
Yes.
new feedback,
Yes.
new learning, stance 2.
So I
right?
think this is the weird irony about this, right? Like most people, myself included, much of the time, are afraid of admitting logical errors in public because, like, oh, then people will look down upon them. When actually, what I see happening, and what happened in the Bitcoin case, is people are craving that. They're craving the permission to change their mind. They're craving the sort of allowance to step out of their group identity and go like, do you know what? Maybe I thought certain things were true. I mean, this certainly goes for the pandemic handling as well for me. I had certain beliefs about what I thought were going to happen, and a lot of those really got put to shame. And a lot of people who were skeptical, to say the least, in the beginning, and I thought like we're a little bit of a crank, turned out to be more right than I was in my analysis. And I just went like, all right, here's some intellectual humility pie being served up, and I should eat it if I want to be a smarter person who has a better chance at predicting the next turn of the world.
Why think in public at all? Like, what's the point? Because maybe in the beginning, and maybe I'm wrong, but maybe in the beginning, because you and Jason, in the beginning, sort of you're a small company, and you want to sort of talk about what you're doing. I've heard you guys talk about the early days of sharing what you're doing and writing books, and it makes sense from a from a marketing perspective. But why continue? Like, why continue sharing in public? Why continue being, open about it? Doesn't that seem also going with the crowd, being public all the time?
Possibly. It's certainly risky. If you take public positions on so many things over the course of 20 years, you invariably will not only offend a large number of people, you offend just a few people all the time, but that compounds like interest does. And after 20 years, there's a lot of people who have strong feelings about your persona based on those utterances and based on those perceived slights over the years. So I can enumerate a lot of downsides to why you shouldn't do it. And I actually, as I said, making the point that as a society, I think we're worse off, that everyone feels the pressure to opine on everything all the time in public because it ossifies so many positions that really should be flexible and open to revision. But for us, and for me, I think it's I don't think it's optional. Like, I just have this sense that I like to share and I like to move understanding forward because my understanding has been moved forward by others doing the same. So I think there's some sense of reciprocity here, that I have changed my mind reading other thinkers on all sorts of topics. So when I feel like I've arrived at an insight, however insignificant that might be to others, I just feel like, do you know what? It's partly my duty to share it, but it's also for me, at least, a way to think. I think much better when I write. And when I've written something down, I also feel like it'd be a shame not to share it. Now that I've arrived at whatever this is, I've arrived at some strong opinions loosely held. So I think that's the crux of it. I enjoy to write. I enjoy to think. I enjoy to change my mind. I enjoy the intellectual challenge of trying to figure out what's what. And then once I've arrived at some conclusions I consider to be, if not stable, then at least helpful, I consider it an obligation to share that.
So I wanted to ask you, what is your writing style? Because both you and Jason and a bunch of people that I think Paul Graham as well, I consider sort of people who write really well consistently over a long period of time. And what is your writing style? Like, how do you go from an idea in your head to a finished Hey post or a tweet or whatever?
Usually very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
That is part of my approach to it. And I think this is, for example, one of those, at least as I've seen, where Paul Graham has a more deliberate style. He gets multiple people to review his essays and have longer gestation periods for the things that he writes. I'm the exact opposite. I have this usually spur of inspiration to commit my thoughts on a given topic, and I'd say 80 to 90% of everything I write is written in 15 minutes or less. That's partly because I don't write long. Most of the things that I write are short essays. Even our books are a collection of short essays. You take Rework, for example. I think it's 88 small essays. Some of them as short as 3 paragraphs. And that comes from this fact that I hate verbose writing. I hate complicated writing. I have perhaps more of an affliction for sort of poetic turns of phrases, but they have to be based in simple language. So the clarity of writing in itself is an interesting optimization task, like combining the clarity, being just plain about it, not trying to dazzle your audience with sophisticated terms when simple ones will do, or words. And then also just having fun with it. Like, I love the word play. I love finding just the right term for something that is kind of whatever, not the expected, or whatever you want to qualify as good, simple writing. And I try to get there by reading a lot and by writing a lot. Like, ever since particularly I started the Hey World blog, which is essentially just me writing emails mostly to myself in my head, I try to write every day. I'll write a piece almost every day. I think in the 2.5 years I've been on, I've written 350 pieces or something like that. It's not quite every day, but like every other day, more or less, at least. And that's a key component of it. A lot of people are like, oh, how did you get good at writing? By writing a lot. I mean, I've been writing on the internet for 25 years. If you added it all up, I must have written at least 10,000 posts.
And does your writing help your code?
Oh, hugely. I consider them to be reflections of the same approach to thinking, to clear thinking. That clear prose is clear thinking. Clear code is clear thinking. This is one of the reasons I don't consider myself a software engineer. I consider myself a software writer. That the level of abstraction in software that I work at is mostly about clear thinking. And not just clear, I mean, you could say there's many forms of clear thinking, and even mathematics is a form of clear thinking, perhaps even more so, or more rigidly so. But within the realm of concepts in the programming world, we talk about a domain language. Like, it literally has the word language in there, of constructing and specifying words and concepts and making them fit into a grander whole, has this, to me at least, character of building up, like, I was about to say cinematic universe, but a literary universe where, like, there's these different characters and they're defined in this way and they act accordingly to their definitions and the world that they exist in and so forth. That's what software is to me when it's best. It arrives at a cohesive universe world where the right words are picked at the right time and they have this level of cohesion and coherence. And that's why it continues to be just such a joy, and it's why I continue to think that the time I spent writing clear prose is time spent practicing clear thinking, which will flow directly into clear programming.
How did you end up inventing like Ruby on Rails? How did that come about? But also, more importantly, why has that been adopted so widely by such a diverse array of people?
So Ruby on Rails came about as a result of me wanting to use the Ruby programming language back in the early 2000s.
Why did you choose that one?
So Ruby was created or released for the first time in 1995 in Japan by a guy named Mats. And for quite a number of years after that, stayed essentially within Japan, had very little following outside of Japan. But in the early 2000s, the likes of Martin Fowler and Dave Thomas, two of the giants of software development industry, started using Ruby to explain technical concepts when they were writing for programming magazines. And I just happened to stumble across some of those and thinking like, this is a very unique programming language. It doesn't look like the programming languages I've otherwise worked with. It is so much cleaner, pure, it looks like pseudocode. It looks like the kind of code you'd scribble down in English to explain a concept, and then you'd have to translate it into like the quote-unquote real programming language. Well, this was just a pseudocode. So I thought this was really interesting. And in 2003, when we started working on Basecamp, I had free reins to pick whatever technology we were going to make it in, because it was just me doing all the implementation, and we didn't have a customer. I was just doing this together with Jason. So I took it upon myself to make the technical decisions, and my foremost decision was, you know what, I want to try Ruby for this project. So I tried Ruby, and within a couple of weeks was just head over heels in love with it. It was just blowing my mind in terms of the depth of concepts. I got introduced to metaprogramming and other more sophisticated techniques that I'd only just scraped the surface of in other programming languages. And then I saw the whole picture. I saw the essence of Ruby, that Mats was on a mission to make a programming language in service of programmer happiness. Very revolutionary concept at the time. Most programming languages are designed on the basis of like whatever, memory usage or machine sympathy, in that sense of like what will run best on an actual computer underneath. Or other sort of ideas of correctness in the formal sense of it. This is what functional programming has a lot of emphasis on. And here is this guy who puts the programmer, who puts the human above the machine, and is willing to do things to the machine that the machine doesn't really want to do, doesn't really like.
Could you give an example? Like,
this is, in terms of parsing, for example, this is not, it's just a simple example. But Ruby has this notion, you can say, if condition, then X, else, something else. Almost all programming languages has this basic conditional form. Well, Ruby also allows you to flip it around, not for any logical purpose for the computer, but it allows you to do things like condition unless X. That's a very language-based nuance. I'm expressing the same concept. I'm expressing, actually, perhaps the clear example is in a normal programming language. You would say, if not condition, then X. Ruby allows you to flip it around. First, you start with the condition. You say, X, unless condition. That's a really novel approach to it that it serves no purpose for the underlying compiled code. It'll result in the same thing. Like deep down in the processor, it's going to be turned into if not. Mats allowed the programmer to express themselves in this way for the pure satisfaction of having a more flowing, more natural programming language that would make you smile. And Ruby has so much of that. It allows you to express code in the closest approximation to poetry in my mind, that there is such beauty possible when you can finesse these subtleties of language, which is a domain I think a lot of programmers have a very hard time with. They're like, finesse of language. What are you talking about? Either it's correct or it's not correct. Either it's fast or it's slow. It's binary for a lot of programmers in a lot of ways. And Ruby was not. Ruby had this whole spectrum of grays of like, yeah, do you know what? It does the same thing, but it reads a little better. And I just love that. It was like noodling with prose. You're like, I substitute words all the time. I'm writing a paragraph and I'm repeating myself a little bit. Let me look in the dictionary here. Let me find something that is even sharper and fits even better. I'm conveying the same thought. I'm just massaging the expression of it. And Ruby allows that massaging to happen. And not just allows it to happen, but puts it on a pedestal. That this is actually what Ruby is about. And incredibly novel approach to programming design. Incredibly foreign to me, but also superlatively eye-opening. This was the inflection point of my career, was discovering the Ruby programming language and going from programming languages or tools that I use to get outcomes to this programming language is such a joy that I'd write it just for the sport of it. Not necessarily because I want outcomes. I usually also want an outcome, but I can just enjoy forming the clay. Like, I want the pot, but you know what? Half, at least, the pleasure of existing as a pot maker here is to massage the clay. is to sit with that turning wheel thing.
Is the flow, right?
It's the flow. That's exactly what it is. It is the flow. And I think this is, I always butcher his name, Mikhail Shemenshkevich, or yeah. Look up Flow. The book is literally called Flow. This was a...
Oh, who wrote Flow State?
Yes,
yeah, sure.
yes, the Flow State book. I think it was written in like the 50s or the 60s. This whole inquiry into what causes human happiness. This was where it started. Why are people happy? What makes them happy? And flow was sort of homed in on as this concept where you are fully engrossed in an activity that's just slightly beyond your capacity. That means you have to stretch. Your mind has to bend a little to the point that you forget about everything else. You forget about time, you forget about space. You're sitting here thinking it's been 20 minutes, but it's actually been 2 hours. Nothing else enters your mind. It's a very zen state of being. And I just figured out through experience that Ruby provided the most reliable portal to that state of flow when it came to programming. And that in itself is almost like an addictive property. The flow state is a very addictive property. There's all sorts of other domains within sports or arts or whatever where people will report these flow states and then have such an enjoyable peak human experience of happiness that the rest of their lives essentially becomes a chase for that. There's a good quote by, I think it was Steve McQueen, who not only was an actor, he was also an ace racing driver. And he classified, in my analysis, this pursuit of flow as racing is life, everything else is just waiting. Where you go, in some ways it's actually a little bit dark, like it's such a singular focus. I don't see it in quite the same way, but I can see where he comes from because this state of flow with a race car or programming Ruby provides such a high, it's almost like taking a drug. It has the addictive properties of taking a drug because it induces a statement of such well-being and life satisfaction that when you're not in that state, the absence is quite clear. So I think this is part of the reason I've stuck with Ruby for so long, is that it is just such a intellectual pill.
And how did the on Rails part come about? And what is the big difference between Ruby and Ruby on Rails?
So Ruby is the underlying programming language. It's a general purpose programming language. You can use it to program any kind of software in it. Rails is a toolkit that uses Ruby to make web applications. So we obviously built Basecamp in that. We built Hey. We built everything that we've made in the past 20 years at 37Signals. We built in Ruby on Rails. But Twitter was started on Ruby on Rails, still has a bit of it in there. Shopify is the largest Ruby on Rails application to this date.
They still use Ruby on Rails?
They still use Ruby on Rails. They're huge supporters. Toby Lutke, who's the CEO, used to be on the Rails core team. He made several substantial contributions to the framework and is heavily investing in both the Ruby programming language and in the Rails framework. Ever so grateful for his continuous patronage there. And then GitHub is famously all on Ruby on Rails and embracing that as well. And a ton of other companies as well. So it's had this great impact in my mind that it's introduced a ton of people to Ruby. So before Rails, Ruby just didn't have a lot of mainstream adoption. I think because it was missing kind of the killer app. A little bit like Python these days have within data sciences or AI. A lot of stuff in that domain is using Python.
Finally, it's like
right. So if you're like, oh, I want to do some data analytics, there's probably a Python package for that. And then Ruby and Rails provided that for that. Oh, I want to make a web application and I'd like it to be sort of very productive to do so. I don't necessarily have a huge team. I want to get started. And I think this was one of the other things that Ruby on Rails did. It introduced a bunch of people who were not already programmers to the ability to create web applications. We have so many people in the Ruby on Rails community who did not have a traditional computer science background, but simply taught themselves how to use Ruby on Rails because it was easy enough to teach themselves enough to start making. And I think then you get that flow going and so forth. So,
very cool. You touched on racing, and that's one of the critical things I want to talk about. How was Le Mans this year?
It was frustrating in the same way it's been frustrating for the last 4 attempts I've done, which is to say that we had mechanical issues that kept us from competing where I think we should have competed. But then on the other hand, it was also gratifying because I drove as good a race as I've ever done. So racing is, especially endurance racing, is this interesting sport where a lot of the components that go into a good result are out of your hands. Like the car has to be reliable. It has to be fast. Your teammates have to make sure that they don't make a mistake. Like you obviously have your crucial contribution as one of 3 drivers in my case, but it's not enough to get a good result. So I look at things in 2 ways. I mainly kind of view whether this was a good or a bad race on the basis of what I could do, my own contribution. Did I contribute to the possibility that we could have had a good result? Yes, I did. And then secondarily, like what was the actual result? So that's been a bit frustrating, but I've now done the race 10 times.
Wow.
And I started in 2012. And I think the saying goes, Le Mans lets you win. As in, you can't win Le Mans. Le Mans has to let you win because of all these factors that have to go just right for 24 hours straight. Actually, not even 24 hours, 40 hours straight, at least if you count, we get up at 8 in the morning and the race doesn't start until 4 and you're not done until late in the evening the second day. So it's this incredibly long, arduous process of getting a car up there, and so many things have to go right for you to be able to be in contention that Le Mans has to let you do that. And I think Le Mans felt like it gave me enough because the first 6 attempts I did, I was on the podium 4 times, including the overall podium, including a win, including every other step of the podium. Like I had such a phenomenally good run the first half or
Wow.
6 times of attempts at Le Mans that I think Le Mans is like, yeah, do you know what? You've gotten your fair share.
Maybe this is I hope I'm not too direct and I don't want to offend you, but how do you, I'm sure you're a good driver, clearly you are, but how do you go from sort of, I think I heard you on the Tim Ferriss podcast a long time ago talk about you didn't have a license for a long time,
Right.
and then you sort of go from that to being, I mean, a racing driver, right? Like, what was the process? I mean, how do you sort of, do you have to have a lot of money to get into Le Mans? Is that the only way you race in Le Mans? Or like, what is the sort of, because I also want to ask you about the classes, because there's like the hypercar, the
LMP2, which is the
that's
class
you.
I was in GT and so
Yeah.
forth. Yeah, there's basically 2 paths to get to become a professional racing driver. One is to be exceptionally talented,
At a
like a 1 in a 10,000th. If you are that good,
And at a very young age,
at a very young age, from like age 6 onwards, you dedicate all your time to go-karting and you go up through the ranks and you are so good, so early, that by the time the sport starts demanding big checks, there's sponsors and others to help you get
who
there.
want to pay you because you're so
Yes,
great. Yeah.
you're on such a track. And I've known a handful of drivers like that. The vast majority of drivers, even at a place like Le Mans, are there because either they or someone they were associated with had a lot of money.
And I mean, it's also F1. Like, there's also a couple of teams where someone's son shows up as
For
a
sure.
racer who's, I mean, of course he's good. No,
Yes.
I'm not saying no doubt, but you know,
Yes.
sorry to go
No.
back. Yeah.
Racing is a phenomenally expensive sport.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of good drivers who never get a chance because they don't have the funds to do it. The truly greats, they get a chance, but the odds are super duper very far along. Although, I mean, if you look at like how many kids play basketball and how many start in the NBA every year, those odds are probably also quite long. So maybe it's not that different in that regard, but it seems different. But this is to me, this is the gift that allows me to go to a place like Le Mans. The fact that the sport requires such a colossal funding to operate, it allows amateurs like me. I didn't get my driver's license until I was 25. I didn't sit in a race car until I was 27. I didn't get my first full racing license to be competitive until I was 30. And I was on the grid at Le Mans when I was 33.
Wow.
That is a journey that's not possible in tennis. You're not going to be like, I'm really rich and I'll put in some effort and I'll become like pretty good. Can I play at Wimbledon? No, you can't. There's no room for you at Wimbledon. The only people who play at Wimbledon are people who've dedicated their entire lives to becoming so good that they can play at Wimbledon. That's not how it is in racing. In racing, there is this idea of the amateur driver. Now, you still have to be competent.
That was my follow-up. I think, like, how would you...
But you would actually be shocked at how little competence you need if your wallet is large enough. Like, there's sort of a relationship here, right? Like, I don't have the largest wallet in the world. I have some, and I wouldn't be there unless I contributed some. But then I also have some skills that makes it such that others want to kick into the pot, right? If you're not very good, you have to pay everything yourself, and then it's just truly mind-bogglingly, fantastically expensive. But if you're like a billionaire and you're like, I want to race at Le Mans, I'd say most billionaires could put in a couple of years and get just proficient enough to be able to start. Like, you'll suck. You will not finish well. That's just how it goes. But you can participate, which is a unique aspect of this sport that it is in this way, and I'm ever so grateful. Otherwise, there's no way I would have been at the grid of Le Mans for 10 times.
And I mean, of course, you have to be good, clearly, right? So what is the difference between a bronze driver, a silver, that's you, right?
Yeah, so...
and then the gold, is it gold? Is that what it's called?
Gold and platinum.
Okay.
So the racing world divides these things in much the same way that the Olympics used to do. You have your amateurs, you have your professionals, and like these are different classifications. And in different classes, you have different rules about how many drivers. In my class, the LMP2 class, which is the one step down from the top class with these prototype, you have to have one silver driver, which used to mean you have to have one amateur driver. Now they've kind of muddled the concept of a silver driver to mean either a good amateur or an upcoming youngster. But let's put that aside. The difference, it's really fascinating. Like, at a track like Le Mans, for example, a lap for us is 3 minutes, let's say 40 seconds. The difference between I'm phenomenally good, I'm being paid to do what I do, I'm highly sought after, can be as little as less than a second to someone like me. That's a 3 minute, 40 second
Wait, 1
lap.
second. Could you repeat that? So someone who's the top of one of the best drivers is a second faster than you?
Yes. It depends a little bit, time, day, blah, blah, blah. But it can come down to basically just that. And that, it seems so wild. You think like, how much is a second? It's got like 1, 2, right? It feels like no gap at all. But on a racetrack, over the course of 24 hours, it's actually quite a lot. If it's just 1 second, for example, at this last Le Mans, I did 100 laps. Oh. That's 100 seconds. That's a minute and a half, a minute and 40 seconds. That's the difference between whether you're winning or you're not, or can at least be the difference between you're winning and you're not winning. So the differences are small, they still add up. And if you want to win, it comes down to this. When you look at it between the more professional drivers, often the distance is 1/10 of a second. This is the same when you see qualifying in Formula One, for example. You see like Max Verstappen earning 30 million, 40 million a year, and like someone a little bit further down the line making like 1/10 of that is like 1/10 and a half slower. Because that is, in the end, what matters. Like, there's this Seinfeld joke about people who go to the Olympics, and you're like, the people or the person who wins the 100-meter sprint, you're like, oh, everyone's heard of it. And the person who finishes one nose behind, never heard of the person, never heard of them. There's some aspect to that. That is just what racing is. It is a lot about the small differences. But they add up when you race for 24 hours.
I mean, for sure. And I think you had a night stint, right? You started at night. When do you have a bedtime? Are we good?
Yeah, I think like 10, 15 minutes.
That's fine. Yeah. Like the most important racing question is, can I get some merch? Because I mean, I think I love the Hey logo. I have it right here. So I'm a fan of the logo, and I think it was like, it's really cool. Sort of I don't see many software companies in the racing world. I'm a Porsche nut, so I'm into sort of, I'm into that space a little bit. I sat in a rally with like a half pro driver once.
Oh, those are crazy. Yeah, rallying is a different discipline altogether. You should look up some of the rallying done in like the 80s and the 90s when the spectators were basically on the track. It looks absolutely insane. I have tremendous respect for people who do that.
I think maybe people need like the next thing. I don't know, but I just discovered like the Isle of Man TT.
Yes.
Holy shit. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, but all racing is a different
category.
It's just like, what is going on here?
Yes. It's a very much of a throwback. It's this motorcycle race on an island off the coast of England where they drive through a town and then up a hillside. And it has the same risk factors as Formula One used to have in the 60s. Like this year, I think 3 people died, and that's just common. 2 or 3 people will die every year that race is on because you're on a motorcycle, you're doing 150 mile an hour through a town. Like they don't put up anything special. If you miss something, you will absolutely hit a wall at 150 mile an hour and it'll go splat.
I don't know of a more extreme
I was just talking to some folks about that. Like, is there any sanctioned sport like that has that risk factor or is even close to it? The only thing I can compare it to is these squirrel suits that people jump off cliffs in. Sure. Like that apparently is also just ludicrously dangerous. I think that might be a little more dangerous than the Isle of Man TT, but only just barely. It is an incredibly dangerous sport, and yet that's what makes it so fascinating. I mean, there's a whole sociology discussion here about how soft we've become as a species. This has level of gladiator-ness to it that is just incredibly compelling. You can hold both ideas in your head at the same time. It's very tragic when someone falls off a motorcycle at the Isle of Man TT and they die. But it's also what gives the rest of the event the glory of it. I do actually think that some modicum of danger and risk is healthy for us, and we should have it. This is one of the reasons I do like race car driving. Modern race cars driven on a track are incredibly safe compared to what they used to be, but people still do die. They still do crash in race cars, and then they die. So the risk factor is still there. And to be honest, it's part of the appeal. It's part of the appeal that there's something of that. Like, I sit in front of a computer all day. Like, there's no risk. Well, there is a great risk, actually, that I could just be sitting in front of that computer for 8 hours a day and my body slowly decomposes and whatever. But that's a long-term risk, decades in the making of the illness of that. Driving a race car has this immediacy of like going on the hunt, I imagine it used to be. Like, all right, let's go get a woolly mammoth. You might get speared. Yeah, all right, sign me up. I think there is just something encoded in our DNA that craves that level of danger and risk and facing quote-unquote death. And the Isle of Man TT riders just take that to 10,000.
And then connecting it back to flow, I can't imagine like a better flow state you could ever be in. Right?
That's exactly it. This is why, to some extent, race car driving is even more enjoyable to me than programming, because it is such a predictable portal to flow. It is actually the exception that I go into a proper race car at a fast track and I'm not in a state of flow, because as you come up to a really fast corner and you're going, as we do at Le Mans, 320 kilometers an hour, you're like, do you know what? If I'm not paying attention right now down to milliseconds, I can make a mistake that'll end very badly. So it demands peak attention. This is one of the reasons why when I talk to my engineer before I start working with a new engineer in racing, I always tell him, don't talk to me when I'm in the car except on the straights. I do not have excess brain cycles to process your speech. Like, I am running my internal CPUs at 100% if I'm trying to be fast and I'm coming up to a corner. Great racing drivers are so good that they can be super fast at 80% and then they have 20% left over for chatting with their engineers. I don't have that. So I'm like, please shut up. Please just let me drive as I get through these corners. And then we can talk on this straight away when like I don't need my peak attention. But that is an example of the demands it places on your capacity, and it's the flow state. It is absolutely the flow state when everything is going just right. And I mean, I still have. So at this last Le Mans, 24 hours, I did 100 laps. Like, they're still going in my head. Like, they get so programmed. It's about 6 hours or something over the course of like 12 I had to do. Like, I'm writing some neural pathways that just keep playing, and they keep playing because it's such an engrossing activity, and it's such a state of flow, and it's so enjoyable in that regard that this is one of the key reasons why I keep racing.
I think we could talk for many more hours, but we'll just wrap there. I think it's a really good place to wrap up. Thank you for the time. I really appreciate it. And let's do a round 2 at some point if it makes sense, online or something. We'll figure it out.
Perfect.
Unless we happen to be in the same country again.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, David. Take care. Bye-bye.